Good evening and welcome, everyone, to the Catholic Anti-Racism Project's second in our speaker series. And here's a question that we can keep in mind as we hear the presentations tonight. Can we use the Catholic Church to provide for racial reconciliation? So our topics tonight are going to be implicit bias, structural racism, and what is white privilege? Our speakers will be Dr. Patrick Egan. He's Associate Professor of Politics and Public Policy at NYU. Kyana Beckles, who is M.P.S, who is CEO of Leverage Assessments Incorporated. And Rajanique Modeste, Ph.D, founder and consultant of Vestiga Organizational Strategies. So in order to start our conversation and get us into the mood, we're going to listen to a couple of videos. One is Implicit Bias with Rachel Goodsell, who's a professor of law and chancellor at Rutgers University Law School, and defining structural inequality. And we'll see what that's about when we get to it. So we're going to start with the first video with Rachel Goodsell.
To this concept of implicit bias, our brain's automatic instant association of stereotypes and attitudes toward particular groups without our being consciously aware of it. And I say without our being consciously aware of it, but I want to be clear. Knowing that we have implicit biases or automatic associations doesn't get rid of them. It's a beginning, but it doesn't make them go away once we know we have them. It just begins the work, hopefully. So how do we know that we have them? Well, there's the implicit association test, the IAT. And have any of you taken this? Okay, so a decent number of you. So the IAT can be found. Please don't take it now because it'll hurt my feelings. But you can Google IAT or Project Implicit, and there's a whole host of sort of little exercises you can do that will allow you to see how quickly your brain can associate some groups with some images, and it gives you a sense of where your vulnerabilities are. It's not a DNA test, and it's actually been methodologically critiqued. Lawyers got really excited when the IAT came out, and we said, all right, we're going to have everybody take the IAT, and everybody who has bias, if you're a police officer, you're fired. If you're a teacher, you're fired. If you're a juror, you're knocked off the jury. If you're a judge, you're fired. If you're, on and on and on. We'd have nobody left because literally there isn't a human being alive who doesn't have some implicit biases against some identity groups. And having implicit biases doesn't mean that we act on them. It's not an excuse. It's the beginning of understanding how our brains operate. So here's an example that's sort of interesting that both shows this sort of way implicit bias operates and also shows how it can have how we can sort of work through something slightly differently. So it used to be that orchestras had a very strong tendency to hire male musicians over female auditions. And of course, the people who were hiring thought that the men were just better. And someone suggested, well, why don't we put up a screen and that will tell us whether or not we're hiring based upon something other than talent. So they put up a screen, and initially there weren't that many changes in the percentage of women who were hired. And so that, of course, made the people who were doing the auditions feel very proud. But then someone noticed that for some auditions, but not others, there was a little click, click, click sound before the audition. Anyone know what the click, click, click sound? Heels. And literally that auditory cue of heels was enough to sort of change the way people were listening. So now orchestras literally make people take off their shoes, or they'll put like a little rug because they want to prevent the auditory cues from affecting the way listen. And what's amazing is after doing this, they increased orchestral seats for females between 25 and 46%. So that's a remarkable one. Now healthcare is probably the area that's been most studied. And that's in part, or significant part, because in 2007, there was a study of medical residents who were given, sort of patient instruments. They'd taken the race IAT, the race implicit association test, a few weeks before. But this was weeks after, so they didn't have any notion that these were connected. And they were asked to diagnose the particular cardiac conditions and then to recommend treatment. And what they found in this 2007 study was that those with higher levels of implicit bias against African Americans were able to diagnose correctly across group, but they didn't recommend the same treatment. They were significantly less likely to recommend the gold standard treatment. So that completely, as it should, freaked everybody out. And so there's been an enormous amount of work done in medicine around this issue. And what's very positive is in recent studies, 2014, 2016 studies, the link between implicit bias and treatment recommendations when the protocol is clear, when there's an obvious treatment, has been broken. Now, where medicine still has a long way to go is on more subjective determinations like pain medication. So there was a recent study of children going to the ER, 4,000 children going to the emergency room for appendicitis. And what they were measuring was whether or not white and Black children were apt to get the same level of pain medication. And they found that white children reporting severe pain were 3 times more likely to receive the appropriate opiate pain medication than Black children. Do doctors wake up in the morning not wanting to cause pain? I don't think so. But this is what happens. And again, the argument is this has happened because of implicit associations.
Process for us, and now we'll have a second short video, which I think again will bring us into thinking about this topic. Wow, that might seem like an exaggeration, but it does give us food for thought. Was it really exaggerated? Was there anything in there that seemed familiar or brought something to mind? But just keep that in the back of your mind as we listen to the speakers who are coming up. And so we're going to start with Kyana and Rajanique. They're going to speak to us a little bit more about implicit bias and structural inequality, and specifically how it affects those of us who are within the Catholic Church. So we'll bring them on now and hear what they have to say. And feel free to put your questions in the chat as they occur to you.
Good evening. Good evening. Thank you, Deborah, so much for having me here. Hi, Kyana. How are you doing?
Hey, sorry, it's muted. Both of those videos kind of made me itch a little bit.
Yeah. I was very became a little angry, so very uncomfortable watching, because it speaks to all the things that we've had to endure, as women, as Black people, and as a race, itself. So that touched me in a multiple ways, to say the least. So
we certainly, I would say that this second video with the race is probably just really accurate in terms of like the disparities in generational wealth and how they impact, our ability to move forward today. I think that we always hear this idea of like, oh, lift yourselves up by your bootstraps. And, when you don't have bootstraps, that doesn't, doesn't work as well.
And particularly, when you can say that, right? Because you've already had a head start for 400 years.
Yeah, so you got plenty of bootstraps.
You got plenty of bootstraps, right? In fact, you were the maker of the bootstraps. So, that was just that was as accurate as it can be. And I know particularly, for the standardized test, which is your area, of interest. So that really spoke volumes of how accurate it is. And I think the visual representation really should touch people's spirits, right? And get an understanding of how we've been impacted as Black people.
So, and I'll talk, and that's a great opportunity for us to introduce ourselves. Both Dr. Rajanique, Modeste, and I are trained industrial organizational psychologists. Many of us, have gathered together as a result of the incidents of George Floyd that we witnessed last summer, and just got tired of being spectators, right? It was no longer appropriate to be a spectator sport, and we had to jump in and sort of release ourselves from oppression, which just became more blatantly clear to not just us, but the entire world.
And that bystander effect, right? That bystander effect really hit me hard, and just wanting to seeing everything happen, and wanting to be involved somehow, some way, shape, or form. So yeah.
Well, so let's just I'm going to say one sentence about oh my goodness. So she happened to talk about implicit association tests, which of course testing is what I do. Implicit association test is, one of the reasons why I'm in the field of selection, this civil service test, and in the field in industrial organizational psychology blew up because of the Civil Rights Act, right? And African Americans wanting access to good civil service jobs, hence the popularity of civil service testing. It's just that because of the structures of our society, most of the tests are developed by white companies and white people within those companies. And Dr. Modeste, I know that you also specialize in, anti-racism training. So if you could give us a sentence on that. And then I think we should just jump into some of these solutions for the Catholic Church, because those videos kind of just my whole brain was a little bit on fire.
Well, you already know I was on fire even before the talk started. So that put me over. That put me over the edge. It did. So, what I want to talk about in regards to anti-racism is that, for so long, organizations have had this idea, this structure put into place where you got that good old boy network, right? Which is some of the things that we saw in the video, where it's next to nearly impossible for people of color to break into those leadership positions. So I specialize in leadership development. I specialize we are change management specialists, and I also, organizational development as well. But what I'm finding, unfortunately, either we're the only in the boardroom, as it comes to black people, black and brown people, and then black women. And then as it pertains to leadership, there's very few of us in leadership positions. So from that aspect of structural, racism, it's preventing, other people of other races, particularly black races, of being able to get into those leadership positions, management positions. And I know that most positions that, are held by black people are those lower level positions. They're kept there for eons, until one happens to break through. And it's just that they become that token black person, in the organization, which that's right. Uncomfortable words to say, but it's accurate words to say, right? So we're not here to be comfortable, with this, because there's just no way to talk comfortably about things that go on. I think it's been far too long that we've been comfortable, that we've just kind of brushed things up under the rug, and we've kind of used this safety net, and allowed things to continue, and with hopes that things will get better. So me into the realm of Kyana and pairing up with you and wanting to, do something in regards to dismantling racism within organizations and dismantling, racial inequity within police departments and everything as it pertains to how we can use our expertise in every organization that we can walk into. That's why I'm here, to make sure that that change happens and that change occurs. It's been far too long that we've just not allowed, we've not been doing anything. So awesome. So here we are, and to do something even within the church as well. So structural racism happens across the board, especially in the church.
Especially in the church. So I certainly, and to give you a little bit more background, I certainly grew up Catholic. I've been practicing Catholic all my life. And so the structures that we see in the greater society are really no different from the structures that we see in the Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. I think that, the same way that we hyper-focus sometimes on, my other work is in police departments, mm-hmm. and hyper-focusing on, racism in police departments, it's not appropriate to ignore racism as a whole in our greater society, mm-hmm. and that all of our products, whether it's an agency, whether it's a municipality, or whether it's a church, are products of that same racist society. I think that it wasn't so long ago, right, that our churches were segregated. Black folks were either, forced to worship in separate and unequal facilities, or we were worshiping in the bottom of churches and we're not allowed to worship in the sanctuary, right? And segregating our churches was just as big of a deal as it was to integrate our school systems, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think I would, of course, be remiss also if I didn't just go back to the entire history, which is always reminded to us by our dear Deacon Radcliffe about, the papal bulls and the church's participation in slavery, right? And essentially their blessing on European nations to bring slaves here from Africa. Mm-hmm. All of that being said, how can we, what are some of the radical solutions? So I'm just going to dump out some of my sort of just high level thoughts. I mean, one of the disparities, right? When we think about the last video talked about wealth gaps between the Black and white family, right? In the race, we can see, grandpa is passing the baton back to his grandson, right? And that's equivalent to maybe passing down property. And we know that property ownership is one of the biggest ways that basically that causes disparities between white and Black families, right? The Catholic Church is one of the largest, is probably the largest property owner on the planet. So one of the things that the Catholic Church could certainly do is sell that property back to Black communities for $1.
Certainly a solution, yeah.
Because ultimately, economic empowerment is at the core. Of structural reform, and really any solution that we put forward that doesn't have a true impact economically is not really a transfer of power. It's still a white group that holds on to power, but is sort of playing nice or deferring to another group that doesn't have power as a peace offering.
Yeah, so I want to unpack that a little bit more in regards to transferring property ownership to, to Black and brown people as a form of reparations, right? So,
so just Black people,
just Black people. Yes, absolutely. So, what is it? Tell me what that looks like, and that transference from the Catholic Church to Black people. What was your idea to what that looked like, and then how could we make that happen?
I'm not sure. And I think that it comes down to having these conversations in the community. I think that oftentimes in the Catholic Church, we think of solutions as top down because our churches are top down, right? They are the epitome of a top down hierarchy. But that if we come to the community and, create a flatter organization, right, where your other stakeholder groups, your community members, your church members actually have a say in how the church is run and how things will be facilitated and how transfers will take place,
right,
then we can come up with these solutions. It's not up to one person. It's not up to the Pope. It should never be just up to one person. It should be, again, that goes to a deferment of power, right? Pass that power over to your community members, your church members, and talk to them about what justice is for them, or how we could further empower their communities.
Yeah, and I feel that solution is extremely uncomfortable, to even maybe bring that to the table, right, where you've got the Black people on one side and the church leaders on the other side, and we're finding we're in the middle and we're saying, hey, this is what this looks like. You could say or be a part of the church by, removing the hierarchical structure of the organization, where again, as far as I know, there's very, very little bishops, Black bishops, in the Catholic Church. So let's start there. Rather than having the three bishops that we know, I'm just giving an arbitrary number, please. Don't hold me to it. Rather than having three bishops, why don't we transfer all that power to the parishioners of the church, and then we can all decide collectively how we're going to run that church? Is that something that you had in mind? Is that what you're thinking of?
No, I think that yeah, that's exactly that. And I think that, to your point, when we think about representation, sometimes we get one or two clergy members that look like us, and we feel like that's a victory. And I think that again is maybe pacifying the community, but doesn't really defer any real power to the community. I think that we're finding the same challenges in other structures. If you maintain the same structure, that you still have one primary group that has the power, that is essentially so that the subordinate group is at the mercy of that power group. And in this case, it is a white church, primarily with Black subordinates. Yeah. So I think that structural change happens with much larger groups, and I apologize because I'm sort of in the dark now.
No, I still see you.
Oh, awesome. I think that representation I think that representation has been used for a long time to placate us and to say, oh, you have one Black bishop or you have one Black priest, and like, you should be happy with that.
And again, it makes us feel safe, like we've made it, right? We've got that one token person, and like, yeah, then you gotta wait another 50 or 75 years before someone else is let through the door. So
yes. But at the end of the day, what you see is that that person has little power to change the entire structure of the system, and the entire structure is still designed so that the majority of us are still the subordinates, right, and do not really benefit from true change. So I think that it is about flattening that hierarchy, and bringing in community members as larger stakeholders, so that we're not just listeners, we're not just coming in to listen to the homily, but we are actually a part of putting the homily together. We are the part of creating the solutions, and we are part of building the change.
Yeah, and I think that starts with educating the parishioners, right? Educating them on what that could look like, and say that no longer do we need to tolerate that one token Black person being the bishop, but now we are now going to say you all have the ability to say what goes on with the church. So get comfortable, because this is, we're transferring what it should have been like, all to everyone else. So first, we're going to educate you of what that looks like, what that means, and then give you some tools to be able to continuously make the mechanism run, efficiently, and have that power transferred to the people.
Absolutely. I know that we're going to get yanked off the stage maybe in about 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Yeah, I could talk.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I know. But I'll also say, I think that we often, we all got brought here because of the George Floyd incident last summer, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that we have a tendency, because the dominant group in the U.S. is white, to think of like all minorities as being the same, and all non-power groups as being co-equal, and right. And so hence sort of the black and brown lumping, and then now you have Asians coming in. I want to say that I think the history of racism in the U.S. is unique from the Black perspective, and I think that when we think about defraying power and changing structures, that we should specifically not just speak in generalities about diversity, about a population that doesn't really exist, but that we should point out the inequities that have been caused by the Catholic Church, specifically for the Black community, and specifically target members of the Black community to be a part of the solutions that come forward.
I completely agree. I think that the solutions are continuous and they're not stopping. And the more that we have these talks, the more that we continue to educate our people and bring this to the forefront rather than, to the background, we can see some real radical change happen.
Well, thank you so much, Kyana and Rajanique. That was really a fascinating discussion. I think that we all have something to think about from what you shared with us this evening.
Thank you, Deborah.
Yeah, I want to remind the audience again, please put your questions in the chat. I can't believe that questions are not arising for you from what you've heard.
Give them some time. They're gonna come up. They got to process something.
Let it flow.
All right, so at this point in time, we want to bring in our next discussant, and that is Patrick Egan, and he's going to talk to us about white privilege. We've heard that term a lot lately, more so now, I think, than we have in the past, and there may be some questions about what exactly is that. So this is going to be our opportunity to learn a little more about what white privilege is about and how we can think about it as we go forward. So Patrick?
Thanks very much, Deborah. And it's great to be joining Kyana and Rajanique in conversation. I'm Pat Egan. I'm a professor of political science at NYU. And I'm going to share my screen. Let me see if I can do this. I think you can see it, right? And I'm going to talk about what is white privilege, and I'm going to speak about this both from my perspective as somebody who studies politics and therefore power, but also as a Catholic who's a parishioner at the Church of St. Francis Xavier here in New York City, and a partner with the Catholic Anti-Racism Project that the speaker series is a part of. So I think it's really helpful, particularly for white people, to hear about what white privilege is. And it's, as Deborah was saying, it's a phrase that's thrown around quite a lot. It's also a phrase, I think, that people of all backgrounds, white, black, brown, and regardless of where you're coming from, respond to with a lot of emotion, anger, pain, shame, guilt. And I think it's important to acknowledge those emotions as we delve into this concept, because it's those emotions are part of how we react and interpret these concepts. So if you're feeling those emotions now, that's totally normal. And if you continue to have emotions like that in response to what I'm talking about, that's also completely expected and something to acknowledge. So white privilege really has a lot of different definitions, and it's the result of and really overlaps with a number of the other concepts we've been hearing about this evening, including racial bias and structural racism. And I think that'll become clear as I talk a little bit more. One definition of privilege, I think, is actually quite helpful for us, and that is a privilege is a special right, advantage, or immunity available only to a particular person or group. And really, these three words, rights, advantage, and immunity, capture, I think, pretty well what white people experience as the result of white privilege. Before I jump into white privilege, I want to say a little bit about what it's not, because I think these falsehoods and misinterpretations arise in a lot of white people's minds when they hear this phrase. So having white privilege does not mean that you've never experienced hardship, or that you haven't worked hard to get where you are, or even that you consciously exploit the advantages that come with being white. So privilege accrues to white people on the basis of their race, even when they face other disadvantages, even if they weren't born into wealth or status, and even if they disavow such privilege. Essentially, you really can't do much about individually as a person about these white privileges accruing to you without taking some kind of disruptive action. To kind of get a little bit more clear about what we mean by white privilege, I think it's helpful to think about three broad categories of these privileges. And I'm going to list them in rough order of how substantial these privileges are. The first is the fact that whites are in the default racial category, and that leads to privileges of racial representation. The second is that whites are part of the most powerful racial group in the United States, and that leads to privileges of what we're going to call racial immunity. And finally, whites are part of the group, the racial group that has perpetuated and benefited from structural racism, and that leads to sustained privileges of racial advantage. As you can see, based upon the conversation that we just heard with Kyana and Rajanique, and also the videos we watched earlier in this evening's presentation, these categories really overlap and reinforce one another. So I'm not saying that you can easily divide different privileges into these categories, but I think it's helpful to think about them separately. I'm going to talk about each of them very briefly. So first, in the United States, white is really the default category. And that is simply to start with the fact that whites are the largest racial group in the United States. That, of course, is changing, and demographically, that will ultimately change as the racial complexion and makeup of the United States changes. But right now, white is often the default, and that leads to privileges of racial representation for white people. So the privileges run from kind of mere convenience to really life-impacting advantages. And we've already heard about some of them tonight. And this list includes just a few of them. They include cultural depictions in TV shows and movies, children's toys, cosmetics and health products, standardized tests, which we heard about, facial recognition and other AI algorithms that are kind of built on white features, and probably most profoundly, pharmaceutical and other medical trials that overrepresent white enrollees and therefore often produce results that may not apply to people who are not white. The second category of privileges according to white people is has to do with the fact that whites are the most powerful racial group in the United States. And because of that, whites are often given a free pass or the benefit of the doubt in many circumstances that are not extended to people of color, leading to privileges of what we'll call racial immunity. So these privileges really can have life and death consequences, and they include many things that we're quite familiar with, given the focus on criminal justice and police reform that we've been hearing about intensely since the summer of 2020. And so they include interactions with law enforcement and security personnel. They include situations that require speaking with the manager or any other person in authority, and that's whether or not that person in authority is white. It includes treatment in hospitals, emergency care, and other medical settings, and that was something that Professor Goodsell talked about at the very beginning of our evening together. And it includes basic customer service in places like stores, hotels, and restaurants. And then finally, the most kind of, I should say that these interactions really can range from those stemming from unconscious bias to those where individuals and systems sustain white structural advantage and thus may fit in the next category. So sometimes these privileges are conscious and intended, and other times they're due to unconscious and unintended bias. Finally, the most profound set of privileges that are accrued to white people on the basis of their race are those that have to do with structural racism. So for centuries, whites in the United States have used laws and policies, business practices, and other, we could say, political economic forces to build, expand, and perpetuate wealth, status, and power. And this means that every white person, whether they want to or not, benefits from these privileges of racial advantage. So these privileges can be on the spot in that you can identify them at the moment and see them happening in real time. But the more kind of profound ones, I would say, are also due to the advantages that accrue to whites as a result of centuries of structural racism in the United States. So some examples of both of these kinds of things, both on the spot and long-term advantages, have to do with things like simple callbacks for job interviews and other hiring decisions. So there's been a whole wealth of studies showing that resumes that are identical in every way, shape, or form, except in terms of the name of the person at the top of that resume, or one name is more easily identifiable as white compared to a name that's more readily identifiable as black. The white resume in these experiments gets much more callbacks from real life employers than do the resumes that are associated with black applicants. And then this was something that, of course, was talked about in the video, which is that accrued white familial wealth and social capital, often, if you go far enough back, tied to slavery and legally enforced segregation, including in housing, jobs, and schools, and other laws and institutions that have advantaged white ancestors and have been passed down over generations. So those of us in this present generation may wish to disavow those advantages that have been handed down over the generations. But the fact is that much of our wealth and social capital can be tied to those advantages that are built in, that were built in due to laws and policies in place for our ancestors. And then being brought up in mostly or predominantly white towns and neighborhoods that have resources such as job opportunities, schools, and public safety that also lead to lifetime advantages. So these are all things that white people tend to have and that non-white people have to much lesser degrees, excuse me. And so finally, just to kind of conclude with what to make of all of this, I think it's important for white people to understand that we definitely, absolutely benefit from the privileges of racial representation, racial immunity, and racial advantage. And that's true whether you want to or not. And I think that's an important thing for white people to acknowledge, is that even if we personally, and I certainly would count myself among white people who disavow these privileges, we still enjoy the advantages that have to do with these privileges. And so a lot of white people say, especially well-meaning white people, say, how can I respond? That's a long and challenging answer that we'll talk a little bit about tonight. But here are a few things to think about. First of all, don't respond. I don't think it's very helpful by feeling guilty This is not a very helpful reaction, and it doesn't lead to constructive solutions. And it actually keeps white people at the center as opposed to thinking about how to build solutions that help people who are not white. In addition, do not do the thing that is in many well-meaning white people's instinct, I'm certainly find myself doing this myself, is to identify instances where you are an exception to the rule and you didn't experience privilege. I can assure you that the number of circumstances that outnumber whatever instances you're thinking of are massive. And so it's not a very helpful thing to sort of tell yourself that I'm an exception to this rule. What can you do? Well, you can be mindful of how white privilege has helped you and disadvantages others. This can help you disrupt on-the-spot circumstances where you see whites being privileged and others being disadvantaged. And finally, you can work to dismantle the systemic biases and structures that perpetuate the privileges that we've talked about tonight. This is a lot to take in and to absorb, and I'm looking forward to talking about this more with Deborah, Kyana, and Rajanique. And thanks very much for listening. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Pat. You gave us quite a bit to think about. That was a very worthwhile conversation and presentation. And it left us also with questions and other, ideas that we need to study more about, I think, and learn more about and figure out, which is what we should be doing tonight also. Where do we go from here? I mean, what are our next steps in trying to solve some of these issues? So I don't see where we have a bunch of questions in the chat at this point in time.
That's okay. I got a lot.
So with the time that we have left, we can have the panelists ask each other questions, and I think that will work just fine.
There are some questions in the comments as well.
I didn't see any.
I didn't see.
Yeah,
you gotta scroll over. I see.
Oh.
So we can do the questions and the comments, and then I've got some questions for you.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Tanya is asking how the church addresses systemic harms to Blacks and people of color via reconciliation and reparations. How is the church doing that or attempting to do that to address systemic harms?
How the church is currently doing that, or how they could best do it?
Either that you want to address.
I would say that they could best do it by, supporting the advocacy for reparations, either through the municipality or, the Catholic Church has all kinds of money. They could also, the Catholic Church could give reparations to Black parishioners directly.
Kyana, I like the idea, in addition to what you're talking about, more generally the idea of flattening the hierarchy. I think that the hierarchy of the church, which of course is overwhelmingly not just white, but also male, perpetuates a lot of inequalities. And I think it makes it difficult, if not impossible, to have bottom-up conversations of the kind that we're having here tonight that might lead to real change.
Yeah, and I think, again, we're not here to be comfortable. So that takes, it takes some courage and it takes some bravery from the few people who are willing to start dismantling that hierarchical structure. It needs to happen nonetheless, right? Because if it doesn't happen, then, like you just mentioned, Pat, they're going to continue to perpetuate the system, the oppressive system that we have been used to for hundreds of years. So, looking at themselves first and foremost, and then saying, I am the problem, and then I can start to provide solutions now that I know that I am the problem. And again, start removing some of those hierarchical systems within the church and allowing other people to have the power.
I think that when I personally felt hopeful when Pope Francis came in. I mean, I really somehow thought that he was going to be the change maker, or at least start to talk about that change. And so I'm still waiting for that. I'm still hopeful.
And I think, so to your point, Deborah, we've been hoping and waiting for a long time, right? I'm done hoping and I'm done waiting. I'm here to make change.
I hear you.
What was, Tanya had another question about the IAT, or is there one before that?
Okay, here we are. And also from Tanya, how can the Catholic Church be actively anti-racist? Images, liturgical expressions from a cultural perspective? What are ways that the Catholic Church can begin to be anti-racist or more?
Yeah, I think just that, the professor in the beginning of the video, when she mentioned how the images that are portrayed in the Catholic Church are predominantly white. I mean, from the white Jesus, to the pamphlets that we read, all of that, is perpetuating the oppression that we see, hear, touch, taste, feel, all of that are from us six senses from as Black people. We see all of that across the board. So I think that's where we can start to make that change. The pamphlets that the parishioners read can be multicultural. Start looking at that representation that you're giving to your parishioners. Start looking at the things that are on the wall, the stained glasses that are within the churches. Everything from the pamphlets, the paintings, the way that you handle your parishioners in the church. All those things can be changed so that it's now from a multicultural view, from a lens, and not strictly predominantly white.
Yes, and I have to say that the church that Kyana and I are affiliated with, Resurrection Church, which is part of this St. Charles Resurrection All Saints Parish, has Black statues in the church. The statues, etc., are Black, and it's almost like a revelation. Sometimes when people come in for the first time, they're like, "Where are these statues coming from?" And it was Father Lawrence Lucas who saw to it that people coming into the church could see themselves reflected in the statuary.
And I also want to make one point, as it pertains to the Bible. You and I both know that, the Bible had a myriad of cultures within depicted in it. But to say that it was predominantly white is just not accurate. So I think that we also talk about those things truthfully, uncomfortably, but it needs to be done again. So yes.
I might also add that I think a lot of there's kind of two sides of this. One is that the popular representation of who is a Catholic in the United States is people who look like me. It's Irish and Italian white people, right? Because that's sort of the misconception that that's who makes up the Catholic Church in the United States, when it turns out that nearly half of all Catholic Americans are who we would call people of color, as Blacks, Asian Americans, folks who are not white. And so the other piece of this is that when church leadership speaks to its flock, when the Archbishop speaks to the Archdiocese of New York, for example, those leaders need to acknowledge the fact that they're speaking to people who are not white. I always feel like there's sort of this assumption that when leaders are speaking to Catholics, they're speaking to white Catholics, and that's just true.
And I think that comes also with this, in the US, we've gone along with sort of this zero culture, sort of, if you don't talk about it, it will go away. And I think that comes from maybe the history of our litigious society, and people feeling like they'll be sued if they actually speak about truths. But there's no such thing, right, as like not bringing your culture to work or not bringing your culture to church. Right. People exist within frameworks. And I think that it's better to speak about those intersectionalities rather than try to act as though, okay, now that I come to church or now that I come to work, like I'm not Black, I'm gonna like pretend to not have a culture or something like that. It's we always want to sort of take away our natural instincts and take away our humanity, but it just makes more sense to be more human and interact with each other as such. You have culture, I have culture. Let's look at each other's strengths and how we can work together.
And that speaks to that psychological safety that we also we know so well about, right? So if in the organization, we are combated with, the structural racism there, and then in the church we see the structural racism there, that there's very little leadership, with of Black people, and then the language that the leadership is using or the archdiocese is using is strictly focused on white people. That is something that we have to not just consider, but actively change as well.
Absolutely. I wanna talk about this testing question. Can we? Oh my goodness.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
Well, there is a sort of a testing question here. Other than the IAT, what are some assessments that the Catholic Church can use to collect organizational data exposing areas of structural racism? Can someone speak to the IAT?
So the IAT is the implicit association test, which is what the first video kind of talked about. The implicit association test was thought to be some sort of a savior for all things equality, right? This implicit association test was going to help us implement affirmative action, and it's going to help us get rid of, fire all the racist cops. But it's just not true. Tests are not as fail-proof as we would like to think that they are. Most all of our test companies are white people in suburban areas designing white tests for other white people. Once you get into the frameworks of generalizability, or once you attempt to generalize, again, you go back to this idea that you're going to make human beings operate like robots, right? The idea that you're going to create this superhuman, non-racist, non-biased person, I think it's not realistic, people. It's just not, there's no such thing. Because of the framework within America that I grew up with, I will always see color. It is impossible to make a Black person growing up in America to not see color. And to say that you don't see color is ridiculous. I'm quite proud of my heritage. I'm quite proud of my nationality, of my history, of my country of origin. So why do I have to pretend that all of that doesn't exist in order to operate in a world? It doesn't.
Yeah, and I think that's only just to make other people feel safe, right? That we're all in this idea that we need to make other people feel safe so that we can just start, or not start, but as you mentioned, operate as robots, so that we just keep passing each other, and just no one just looks at each other for who they are and what they are, and just and you keep going on that way. And that's not realistic. We can identify each other's differences and still treat each other as human beings on the most basic of levels. That's what it is. We are humans, but our differences between our skin color, our hair color, or our hair shapes, our body shapes, those are real identifiable differences, right? And that's okay. That's what makes us human.
Somehow in this country, being different has come to mean being less than. And that's what the problem is. And when people say to me, I don't see color, I freeze up. I'm like, I need to get away from this person. There's something wrong
Are you blind? What's happening?
There's something wrong there.
Yeah. I know that there's, we've got very little time, but there's another question.
Okay, it's going to come up. So this is also from CB. Do you believe faith has been used as a shield from dealing with race?
Absolutely.
Yeah, 1,000% so, yes.
1,000% is nodding their head on this one.
Yes.
I mean, yes, we all believe that's true. And that's one of the things we're trying to fight against, one of the things that we're trying to change.
Yeah. Yes. And I think Kyana mentioned the papal bulls, right? That's how they've, the church specifically has allowed for the systemic racism to be perpetuated in the world as we know it. So,
but also empowered it. I mean, it's not just an allowance, it's an empowerment and perpetuation. And we know that it's time to walk the dogs. Tell them that tell them we're almost done. But I think, so I want to, yes, absolutely, sitting and praying. I mean, we talked about this a little bit beforehand, but just prayer is not enough. Prayer without work, right, as we know, does not lead to an end. Right. People who are faithful do better to pray and use their faith in conjunction with some sort of an action, take an action, whatever that is, go into your community meetings to support, right, the protest, to support calls for reparations, to support calls for equity. Those are ways that you can actively be a part of the change, rather than sort of sitting idly by and maybe praying and hoping and waiting. I'll say also, I think that So there are some assessments, obviously, that some assessments are better than others, just like cars, just like any other product, right? Some products are better than others. I think, though, that the use of assessments sometimes implies for folks that this one test is going to save our life. And I want to say that deconstructing structures that perpetuate racism is an ongoing and perpetual commitment. It is not something that you're going to do overnight with a test. It is not something that you're going to do overnight by praying the racism away or pretending that you don't benefit from some benefit of from being within your group. It is a long going, sustaining commitment to do the work and the practice of rebuilding and reconstructing structures that are equal in all sorts of different ways. And that work starts with identifying the outcomes that you want to see from those programs. I think that economic outcomes are really important. In any structural change, you have to empower the people, and people are empowered by money. So
remove that wealth disparity that we've been, that we've had for so long. Yes.
I mean, we are running out of time, but I just want to thank our panelists for a very rich and wonderful conversation and thought-provoking conversation. I think everyone who has been listening will be able to leave here with some things to think about and some actions, hopefully, to take. So I want to thank all three of you for being with us tonight, and I want to thank everybody who joined in. I do need to make an announcement, which is that, so there's another segment of the speaker series that's going to come up on May 4th, and it's going to be Realities of Immigration, and talk about a timely topic. So I'm hoping that everyone will join into that, and please tell your friends and relatives to come and participate in that, because I think it's going to be something worthwhile. So again, I want to thank you all for participating.
Thank you, Deborah.
We'll keep this conversation going. It's never over.
That's right. This is what's necessary. You got to keep the conversation going and then take action. Don't talk about it. You got to do it.
Be about it.
Okay. Yes.
Great to be with everybody. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you for joining us, Pat. It was very enlightening. Very enlightening. So.